NBA offenses are out of control right now. Every night, a team puts up 140 points in a game. We have 150-something to 150-something non-overtime games now. Teams are averaging over 120 points per game. NBA offenses have never been better than they are right now. 20 years ago, the league leader in scoring was the Dallas Mavericks. 10 years ago, it was the LA Clippers. And if you took every team scoring average from this season and compared it to those, 29 teams are averaging more points per game this year than the league leaders in that category from 1 or 2 decades ago. So the question is, what is happening? How are teams this good at scoring? And maybe more importantly, is it a problem? First and foremost, this is the foundation of every argument for the rest of the video. Players are better now. They might not be better all around. They might not be better at defense, rebounding, all these different things. But from a shot making perspective, players are better. Every single team in the league has 1 or 2 guys at least that are unbelievable shot makers from basically every spot on the floor. Terry Rozier goes out and puts up 40-point games like it's nothing. Even the worst teams in the league have great shot makers, and the best teams in the league have guys that you can do absolutely nothing about. They're better from 3-point range, they're better from the mid-range, they're better at attacking the rim, they're better at drawing fouls, all of that stuff. From an offensive perspective, the skill, the talent level overall in the NBA has never been higher, and it's not remotely close. Now, to go along with that, a lot of people assume that this generation of NBA players are softer and they flop for calls all the time. So I'm sure a lot of you, your first thought with this video was, well, scoring is higher because teams are shooting more free throws. But that's actually not the case at all. When you look at 20 years ago, teams were averaging just over 18 free throws a game. When you look at 10 years ago, teams are averaging just under 18 free throws a game. And this year, it's right about the same number. It might feel like guys are flopping for calls more. It might feel like there's more games where teams are spending a ton of time at the free throw line, but statistically, that's just not the case. Okay, so your next thought probably then is it's the 3-point shooting, right? Everybody in the league now is extremely good at shooting threes, so you'd assume that that's the reason for the increase in scoring. But again, there's a marginal difference. 20 years ago, 3-point shooting percentage was right around 35%. 10 years ago, it was right around 36%. And this year, it's a little bit over 36%. An improvement, but not enough to account for the crazy spike in overall scoring numbers. Well, okay then, Tucker, so what is it? Well, what's the reason for the crazy scoring? Well, first and foremost, pace. This is arguably the biggest statistical difference this year compared to 20 years ago. There's a 10% increase on average in terms of pace for these teams. Teams are playing faster, more teams are playing faster, and it's leading to easier buckets, especially at the rim and at the 3-point line. More possessions equals more points. Of course, that's going to make sense. The second part of this is something that I'm sure plenty of you thought about when I mentioned the 3-point stuff. The volume from the 3-point line is crazy right now. When you look at 20 years ago, right around 15 per game, 10 years ago, 21.5. This year, on average, these are league average numbers, by the way. These are not at the top of the league. These are not, at the bottom of the league. These are league average numbers for every single team. This year, teams are taking an average of 35 threes per game. And so, of course, when you're taking more threes and you're hitting a higher percentage, as I showcased earlier, scoring is going to go up. But the last part of this is the most important, and it is the most undervalued aspect of this, because oftentimes when people talk about NBA scoring, they gravitate to the 3-point shooting numbers or to just assuming that it's the free throw shooting and guys are getting a ton of calls. The biggest part of this is actually what those calls and those free throws, as well as the spacing and the 3-point shooting, means for 2-point shots. When you look at overall field goal percentage, league average 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and this year, there is a distinct improvement from teams in terms of their ability to make shots. And as I mentioned earlier, players are definitely better at shot making, but the quality of shots have improved dramatically. The league has spent 2 decades becoming more friendly to offenses through different kinds of rule changes, and teams have also spent 2 decades perfecting modern offenses. The 3-point shooting volume and percentage obviously have an impact on scoring, but arguably the bigger impact that it has is it creates so much more space. Teams don't take a ton of mid-range twos anymore. Points in the paint are a huge part of NBA offenses, arguably even more than 3-point shooting is. Teams get to the rim at an incredibly high rate. They drive at an incredibly high rate, because in the past, where you see all of these lanes and places for players to drive to, there would be a guy there on the block or on each block. There's so much more spacing, and it's almost impossible to defend. Teams definitely were worse at 3-point shooting back then. They didn't take as many threes, but the bigger deal is teams now are better at getting to the rim because it's easier to get to the rim. And so it's very simple, right? More three-point shooting, better shot making, better shot quality at a faster pace is going to equal the out-of-control NBA offenses that we have now. But the real question is this a problem? Is this an overall negative for the game? Because we know that the league's motivation over the past 2 decades was to improve NBA offenses to make it a more fan-friendly product. They didn't want these 80 to 85 rock fights in the mid-2000s. They wanted this product. This is a product that the league has been pushing towards for years. Maybe it's gotten more out of control than they ever wanted it to be, but it's clear that their motivation was to get to this point. And now that it's gone above and beyond that, we have to think about, is it healthy for the league? For the most part, it seems like people are enjoying the offensive explosion. They're enjoying watching these games where everybody's scoring all the time. And a lot of times it is beautiful basketball. There's ball movement, there's spacing, there's cutting, there's elite shot making, and it's super, super fun. The problem isn't the scoring, at least in my opinion. The problem would be if every single NBA game looks the exact same way. If every NBA game is 130 to 140 and everybody is just setting ball screens in the middle of the floor with spacing on the perimeter, driving to the rim and kicking it out. If that was what every game looked like, then the regular season product, which is already a pretty big negative for the league as a whole, would be even more of a negative for them. It would be so boring because you would turn on one game and the next and they would all look the same. And I think right now you could argue that that is a problem for the league right now. You could disagree with that if you'd like to. There are a handful of teams like Denver, like Golden State that play different ways, but for the most part, it does feel like all these teams look the same. When the offense is rolling, when things are looking good for these teams, when they're playing at their optimal level, there isn't that much of a discernible difference. All these teams take a ton of threes. They all drive the ball a ton. They all try to get to the free throw line. And so really scoring isn't the issue. It's potentially the streamlining of modern NBA offenses that have led to this scoring explosion and what that means for the actual on-court product. Because you can look at the stats and you can poke holes in this decade compared to that decade. But when you're actually watching the games on a night-to-night basis, if the fan base is bored, that's the most damaging thing you could possibly have. It might be more fun on a night-to-night basis sometimes to have more points, but if everybody looks the same, that is where you really get into trouble. And then beyond that, the question is, where do we go from here? What is the league going to look like in another decade? Are teams going to be scoring 140 points per game? Is there another level that we can get to? Are teams going to be taking 53s a game a decade from now? Or have we reached the peak? Is this as efficient as NBA offenses can possibly be? Like I said, they spent 2 decades figuring all this stuff out, changing the rules, trying to make it as good as it can be. Is there another level? Because if there is another level, at that point, it might become a problem because it would be as impossible to guard as it ever could be. Right now, it feels like it's impossible to guard some of these guys with the spacing and the skill level. And if all these trends that we've talked about throughout the entire video just continue to get more and more streamlined and more efficient, at what point does it stop, or does it stop? So next time you're watching an NBA game, think to yourself, this version of offense, all this offensive explosion, do I like the way this is right now? Or did I enjoy games a little bit more 5-6 years ago? Or will I enjoy the game even more 10 years from now if teams are even more streamlined and they're even better offensively? Because ultimately that's what matters. The NBA is built around the fan experience. And if you guys aren't enjoying the games, they will make changes. And what changes they make depend entirely on what the next decade of NBA offenses look like.